What is the largest space that exists within the One Piece world? Well, there's a hole in the ocean that once held the Lucia Kingdom. That's a pretty big one. Just a giant void within the planet itself. There's also literal outer space. That's pretty big as well. Or the great space and time that is the Void Century. And you know what? I'd have to imagine that after giving birth to 85 children, the space between Charlotte Linden's legs may be one of the most cavernous voids in all of fictional existence. However, even with all of that in mind, there is no space larger than the sheer gap between the rank of Admiral and Vice Admiral. There is a great imbalance within the Marines. It's a very top-heavy organization. At any given time, you have 3 individuals, any of whom are capable of standing one-on-one against an Emperor of the Sea, and up until recently have been godlike characters in One Piece who we have had no hope of standing against, and then directly one step below them are the Vice Admirals, who historically have never had any hope of standing against anyone. Despite being the 3rd highest rank within the Marines, Vice Admirals have never been a problem, and that is a problem. Because Eiichiro Oda wants us to take them seriously. He wants us to feel fear and tension whenever they show up. However, due to his own actions as an author, Eiichiro Oda has made this impossible. And so Vice Admirals occupy this very, very awkward space in the story where the author wants you to expect something from them, but never delivers on that something. So at the moment, there's about 30 canon Vice Admirals in One Piece, and I think it would be quite a challenge for most fans to name 5 of them, because they're so disposable that they're usually not worth the brain space to remember. Let me give you an example. To me, this is a pretty perfect illustration of the space that Vice Admirals occupy in this series. In chapter 705, we are introduced to Vice Admiral Maynard the Pursuer, a man who is both introduced and defeated in the very same chapter. Maynard the Pursuer appears to fight battle and defeat Gambia, and then the next time we see him, Maynard is knocked out and lying in a pool of his own blood after being beaten up by Bartolomeo. This is why it's hard to remember their names, and why it's even more difficult to take Vice Admirals at all seriously. And later on in Dressrosa, this happens again, this time with Vice Admiral Bastille, who gets to fight Sabo for a page and a bit before he too is knocked out and lying in the now trademark Maynard Vice Admiral position of shame. So what's going on here? Well, if you're a Star Trek fan, then firstly, congratulations, good choice. But secondly, you may recognize this as something of a Worf effect. The Worf effect is named after Mr. Worf, a big scary Klingonman, who in theory is usually the most physically powerful and capable character in any given scene. But what happens is, for the writers to show that an enemy of the weak is a true threat, the first thing they have that threat do is defeat Worf. Only then can we as an audience take that threat seriously. But after happening so many times, it just gives you the impression that Worf really sucks at fighting, and that if anything, he's weaker than most of the humans aboard the Enterprise. Which is exactly what's happening in One Piece with the Vice Admirals. They serve as a Worf effect to make our protagonists feel fearsome, and so they often exist as podium characters. They are designed to elevate others. Like in Dressrosa, we have Vice Admirals who elevate Bartolomeo and Sabo quite well, but they do nothing for themselves. And that's not to downplay Bartolomeo and Sabo, especially Sabo. He's second in command of the Revolutionary Army. Arguably, a Vice Admiral just shouldn't be an issue for him. But it's when you keep consistently using Vice Admirals like this, the rank loses its power. It's no longer threatening or tension building to hear that a Vice Admiral is in the area, because we have no point of reference to actually view them as a problem. All it means is that someone's going to have to wash their hands soon due to all of the Vice Admiral blood that's about to be shed. Now look, I don't blame the next two for this, but during Marineford, Vice Admiral John Giant and Lons were both podiums for Whitebeard, and fair enough because he was the strongest man in the world, but it's more indicative that Vice Admirals are really only here to serve as a staircase for other characters. And what's worse is that it never seems to matter how many Vice Admirals there are. You could have 100, even 1,000, maybe even 100,000 of them, and the outcome would still be the same. During the GLR arc, we get our first scene featuring multiple Vice Admirals. Their names are Mozambia, Stainless, and Cancer, but you may remember them better as the guy who was being controlled by Doflamingo, the guy who was being attacked, and the guy who was just sitting there watching it all happen. All it took was one Flamingo casually using his abilities to render 3 Vice Admirals completely useless. And these aren't supposed to be fodder Vice Admirals either. These 3 guys were important enough to have been present for a meeting with the 7 Warlords of the Sea to select who the next Warlord would be. We're not just inviting any old Marines with a bit of free time this afternoon to this meeting. No, we need sharp minds and strong fight powers in order to stand up to the Warlords if they cause trouble, and these 3 had neither of the things it is we want. And we've only actually seen one of them go on to become in any way relevant as One Piece has continued. continued. And that would be Stainless, who was the man put in charge of capturing Buggy the Clown when the Warlord system was dissolved during Wano. And it must be said that he ended up doing a pretty rubbish job of that, as his entire fleet was destroyed by Crocodile and Dar's bones. Just the two of them is all it took. Meanwhile, Mazambia and Cancer haven't been seen in canon material since they made contractual appearances during the Paramount War somewhere in the background. And you've really got to wonder how Buggy saw Stainless and was in any way worried, because that's the Vice Admiral disconnect. At this point, it's very difficult to use them dramatically. Oda tries. He's like, Vice Admiral is here. And then character reacts to Vice Admiral going, oh no. But as readers and watchers, we just can't take them seriously. And the Vice Admiral's stain has even infected once competent characters like Smoker. Pre-time skip, Smoker was an absolute beast. Someone who was completely insurmountable to Luffy. And in fact, Luffy lost against Smoker on several occasions and had to be rescued by outside effort. Not to mention that Smoker clashed relatively evenly with Ace. This guy was a huge problem. But then during the time skip, Smoker got promoted to Vice Admiral, and from that moment on, he started losing every single fight. He was beaten by Trafalgar Law, he was bested by Caesar, trounced by Virgo, who to be fair was also a Vice Admiral, so at least one Vice Admiral was putting in a decent showing. But Smoker was then also beaten by Doflamingo, something of an established Vice Admiral slayer, due to what we've explored earlier with Mozambia, Cancer, and Stainless. But during Smoker's debut as a Vice Admiral, he lost 4 times in a single arc. And look, correlation is not causation, but Smoker only started putting in a garbage performance after he was promoted to Vice Admiral, so that really makes you think. If Smoker was still a captain, I can't help but wonder what his true potential would be right now. But it's not just performance that makes the Vice Admirals feel a little less than intimidating, it's also very much their lack of performance, to which I would point vigorously in the general direction of any slobby. This was the first time in One Piece where Vice Admirals were introduced en masse as an immediate threat to the Straw Hats. Outside of filler material, that is, but we'll get to that. In chapter 420, we are left with the dramatic cliffhanger that the Buster Call has arrived at any slobby, and it is being commanded by the powerhouses that are Vice Admiral Strawberry, Yamakashi, Doberman, Onigumo, and Momonga. Now, because I'm a very old man, I remember how impactful this 2-page spread was when it came out weekly. Any slobby was a wild time to be reading One Piece weekly. And at the end of this chapter, there was an expectation that we were going to be fighting Vice Admirals, which I don't think is unreasonable, because in Robin's flashback, at least one of the Vice Admirals of the Ohara Buster Call did get very involved, and the Any Slobby Buster Call was going to take even more effort to get under control. So it was quite disappointing when these 5 upstanding gentlemen did absolutely nothing. They just sat there on their floaty boats and watched the Straw Hats win and escape. In fact, it's slightly worse than that. In the case of Onigumo, he even helped us out quite a bit by shooting one of his own men and ordering the obliteration of the marine ship containing Luffy and Rob Lucci at the time, thus reducing the overall power of the Buster Call by 10% and making our escape significantly easier. And now I want to go through what every other Vice Admiral did during the Any Slobby incident. So we're going to do that, and we're done. Realistically, yeah, I understand that the role of a Vice Admiral in a Buster Call is to be in command. They can't all pull a Kuzan and hit the front lines. So in terms of battle tactics, it makes a lot of sense for them to be physically inactive during any slobby, but it doesn't feel quite right in a shonen battle manga where the story is actively told through physical fighting. And given that they were tactically outplayed as well, it just makes the Vice Admirals look pretty useless on both fronts. Although, given what happens when Vice Admirals do fight, there may be an argument to be made that they're actually much more intimidating when they do nothing, because it's very hard to say whether or not Oda did a better job with them during Egghead Island, which is when we summoned 9 Vice Admirals to command the Buster Call on Egghead, which included any slobby veteran Vice Admiral Doberman, but also introduced us to Vice Admirals Pomsky, Dole, Tosa, Urban, Bluegrass Hound, Red King, and Guillotine. Now, the one thing I will say for these guys is that it did solve a issue with the Vice Admirals, which was that traditionally they had quite uninspiring and difficult to remember character designs. And I think that's because of how Oda needed to use them. As we've established, Vice Admirals are usually more mechanical characters. We don't want to focus on them too much because they exist as podiums to make other characters look better, which is why a lot of Vice Admirals have very, let's call them background friendly designs. Not always, of course, and especially not on Egghead Island, because the Vice Admirals here, it felt like Oda was finally taking taking these guys seriously, because he spent a ton of time making these Vice Admirals feel very distinct, all different shapes, sizes, ages, genders, and even races. That one guy, Urban, looks like he may even be part ancient giant. It's really cool stuff, and it is a very welcome change from just seeing an army of dudes in suits. And with Dol and Bluegrass in particular, Vice Admirals were actually a force to be reckoned with on Egghead. Those two had a pretty devastating run before Jewelry Bonnie turned them into kids, and in addition to that, they also had their own little C plot happening in the background when the Giants arrived, and they had their discussion about Jaguar D. Sol, who is also a former Vice Admiral, I should say. And this is a plot that's currently unresolved, but Oda does seem to be planting seeds for the future with Dol and Bluegrass, which is exciting and unexpected for Vice Admirals. But the rest of the Egghead Vice Admirals turned out to be more business as usual. One of the more notable encounters was with Red King, who briefly stood against Frankie, and he was beaten in a single punch. And look, I love Frankie. Seeing him fight is always a treat, and seeing him win is even better, but I do feel like a Vice Admiral should be able to give Frankie a bit more of a challenge than getting one shot. Meanwhile, Pomsky, right beside him, got transformed into a child and kicked by Jewelry Bonnie, whilst Guillotine just stood there and watched, very much recreating the Vice Admiral trio dynamic of Jaya, where two of them fought fruitlessly and one of them just watched. But these three were a third of the Vice Admirals brought to Egghead Island, and they were decimated by a 12-year-old girl and a cyborg in Speedos. As for the others, Tosa was defeated by Brocky, whilst Doberman, Urban, and Hound did literally nothing. Although Doberman did get one shot by Saint Saturn after the battle, so look, apparently it doesn't matter if they don't end up fighting the Straw Hats, the Vice Admirals will always find a way to get one shot regardless. Again, it's so hard to take them seriously, and that's not good because we're supposed to. But more often than not, they turn out to be jokes, and in many cases, quite literally. There's a whole series of gag Vice Admirals who exist just for the sake of a joke. Kommel is a great example of this. He was, we'll generously call him the main antagonist of Ace's cover story, and his character arc was about solving the issue with his bitter morning coffees. There's also a Vice Admiral named Nazu Ketagari, which in Japanese is a pun. His name means want to name someone, and he's the Marine in charge of assigning code names and epithets within the organization. Stuff like Ship Cutter T-Bone, Black Cage Hina, and even the fact that Kobe's epithet is hero is all canonically the doing of Nazu Ketagari. He also handles the assignment of Admiral code names, taking a color and an animal to make Aokiji, Aokinu, Fujitora, Kizaru, Ryokugyu, etc. And this joke Vice Admiral has even named two more joke Vice Admirals, Momo Usagi and Chaton, Pink Rabbit and Brown Pig, who were actually created by readers sending in questions to Oda in the SBS segments, and Oda enjoyed them so much that they've become surprisingly prominent and even more surprisingly canon. As well as a Marine Easter egg character, every now and then in group shots you may be able to spot this Marine with a hamburger for a head. And look, I want to stress that this is not confirmed, but it is highly suspected that he is also a Vice Admiral because this entire rank is a joke. Good jokes, I should say, very good even. I love all of the Vice Admirals I just mentioned, but again, I'm not really on board with the whole idea that these are the guys who are just one step away from Kizaru. And another thing that really hasn't helped the perception of Vice Admirals is how they're portrayed in extended One Piece media, especially in the early days. Around the Skypiea era, the Vice Admiral rank was abused a fair bit because the filler writers needed to create original antagonists, and using pirates all the time would lack variety, and they couldn't touch the Admiral rank, that was forbidden, so Vice Admirals were seen as a good solution. Like Jonathan, the Vice Admiral in charge of G8, an absolutely brilliant filler arc, and Jonathan himself is an extremely well-written character. He has so much heart, but he doesn't quite pack the oomph that we've come to expect of a Vice Admiral. And in One Piece Movie 4, Dead End Adventure, the main antagonist is a former Vice Admiral named Gaspade, who definitely has a lot more of that oomph and is a big struggle to defeat, but ultimately pre-Gear, pre-Haki, pre-Time Skip Luffy does defeat him, which can also color the perception of Vice Admirals for those who do seek out the extended media. There are some very important exceptions to the Vice Admiral rank though. Obviously, we need to mention Monkey D. Garp, who is and probably always will be the most famous of Vice Admirals, but he also doesn't really count because he was offered a promotion to Admiral on multiple occasions. So I'd say a better example of an exceptional Vice Admiral would be Momonga, who we have mentioned already. He was one of the dudes who did nothing during Enies Lobby, but in his defense, he has put in a pretty decent performance post Enies Lobby, with one amazing moment of stabbing his own hand to avoid being affected by Boa Hancock's abilities, and during Marineford, Momonga also got the better of Luffy and dealt him a pretty devastating slash. Momonga is the vague model that I want all Vice Admirals to be. Whenever Momonga is on page or on screen, he is actually actually capable of exuding what this rank is supposed to be. But unfortunately, he's an exception. As is Virgo, a Vice Admiral double agent who may even be the exception, considering he was tough enough to essentially become the primary antagonist of Punk Hazard. And I think that Virgo displays the true challenge that Vice Admiral should present prior to innovations like Devil Fruit Awakenings and Haki Advancement. He was real difficult to beat, as all Vice Admirals should be. And look, other Vice Admirals do exist. There's Suru, her power is to do laundry. Then there's also Hotogisu, she helps Suru do laundry. And then we have Best Boy Dalmatian, who to be completely fair has fingered Luffy, so he does have a accomplishment. By and large though, Vice Admirals are just extremely underwhelming. And that is one of the rare failings of One Piece in my opinion, because they have so much potential that I don't think will ever get to properly be explored. And every time I see them in the future, I know that they'll either be present to stand and react, or to kneel and become a podium for another character.